Okay, everyone, we're gonna get started. Is this working? Was. Ooh, there it is. Okay, thanks for coming. If you're getting food, don't rush. Just fill in the seats when you're done. I'm Catherine Bracey. I'm the founder and executive director of the Tech Equity Collaborative. I don't think we need that much. We are activating and educating tech workers around a set of issues that we think will make it so that as the tech economy grows here in the Bay Area, it's creating more opportunity for more people and not driving displacement and inequality. We do that in a variety of ways, including educational events like this. We also do policy advocacy work around housing and other issues of inequality in the region and at the state level. We are a member-driven organization. How many of you work in tech or are a tech professional? Okay, so we love for all of you, even if you don't work in tech and you just like what we do, to become members. Your support helps us do the work that we do, through events like this, brings your voice to the table around advocacy issues when we're talking to policymakers. It really helps when I can say we represent X number of tech workers who really believe in this. And this is one of the reasons why you should do it. It's $50 a year, and you can sign up at the front desk once we're done here. Couple of housekeeping items. We do have a code of conduct at all of our events, which there are copies at the front if you want to read the whole thing. It basically boils down to, this is a safe space for learning. We're all coming at this from different perspectives. We want to respect all of those perspectives and give everybody the opportunity to really get what they came here for, which is to understand the issues. That doesn't mean, we don't have, critical dialogue. But it does mean that we respect everybody's opinion. We're not rude, and we don't sort of take more than our fair share of space in the conversation. So with that, I want to introduce our co-hosts you're sitting in their building. We thank them for having us. And Derek Sagehorn, who is a member of East Bay for Everyone, is going to talk about what East Bay for Everyone does, and then introduce Jessica and get started with the discussion. Thanks.
Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. I know it's not ideal with the weather, but I appreciate seeing everybody out here to talk about what we can do in terms of making our communities a little bit more inclusive. East Bay for Everyone is a member organization that's driven by volunteers, and we value inclusivity, transit-oriented development that can help drive down greenhouse gases. We can, fight for climate action, and we also believe in anti-displacement through building housing at all income levels. So our communities kind of thrive for people who've been here, and then we can welcome people who want to move to our communities as well. One of the campaigns that we're working on currently is we'd like to see more multifamily housing in Rockridge. And so we have a campaign called Upzone Rockridge that we're really excited about. Next week is our next February meeting. It will be at 7 p.m. On Wednesday. We can talk about Upzone Rockridge and some of our other efforts there. And then on Saturday, February 23rd at noon, we'll be having a town hall with Bay Area or East Bay legislators. That would be Senator Nancy Skinner, Senator Rob Bonta, or Assemblymember Rob Bonta, as well as Assembly Member Buffy Wicks. So the town hall will be focused on housing issues. So if you're interested in learning more about what's going on at the legislature this year, I would really recommend coming out on Saturday, February 23rd at noon. So we're going to do some Q&A after Ms. Trounstine speaks. So we'll have note cards, and I have pens as well. So if you could, during the presentation, if you could just write down a question you may have, we'll collect them and choose some questions. If we have some time at the end, we'll also open it up to the floor. But I just want to introduce first our guest. Jessica Trounstine is an associate professor at the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Merced. Her work focuses on state and local politics and quality of representation. She is the author of Political Monopolies in American Cities, The Rise and Fall of Bosses and Reformers, as well as the subject of tonight's event, Segregation by Design, Local Politics and Inequality in American Cities. So without further ado, please welcome Ms. Trounstine.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm excited to speak to your groups and to hear your questions and have a conversation about my work. So I thought what I would do is tell you a little bit about my work and how I came to this project, and then describe what I find in the book. So we all know that the quality of public goods, which are services and benefits that are provided by the government, are variable, right? Highly variable. Some people have access to good schools, well-paved and plowed roads, sewers that never overflow, public parks with playgrounds and restrooms, adequately staffed police and fire forces, and clean water. And other people do not have access to those resources. So this is the puzzle that motivated the book. Why are some communities well-resourced and other communities not? The answer, it turns out, maybe unsurprisingly to people in this room, is segregation. And by segregation, what I mean is the concentration of people of color and people of lower incomes in residential locations that are apart from whites and the wealthy. So what I find in the book is that it is segregation that's shaped by local political processes that permits this unequal access to public goods and services to persist. So over the course of the United States history, we've had a tremendous amount of demographic change and a lot of change at the city level and at state and national levels. And yet it is the history of segregation has been embedded in our cities, and that's the story that I tell in the book. So to help explain the research and these processes, I worked with an artist. His name is Derek Ritter, and he's the person who drew the amazing comic that is the first 8 pages of the book. So I'm going to try to tell you the story of the comic without reading the comic, which seems weird and nobody would like that. So, okay, so here we are on the first page of the comic. Meet Tom and Jen. They're white, obviously. And they are, Jen is pregnant with baby Katie, who you'll see down here. So they're searching for their first house. And this is actually an example from where I used to live in New Jersey. So they're searching for a house in Camden, New Jersey. And they have this long list of priorities. So they want to spend less than $150,000. I know, it sounds really crazy, but really, that's possible in Camden. So they want to spend less than $150,000. They want to have 3 bedrooms. They want a good school for Katie. Oh, you're laughing. Good, this is good, right? I know, it seems laughable. They want low crime, nice neighbors, old world charm, but renovated. And they want to live nearby a park or walking trail, and they want an easy commute to Philadelphia. So if you know this part of the country, Camden is literally just across the bridge from Philadelphia, and it developed as its own city, but in many ways intimately tied to the economy of Philadelphia. So many people who live in Camden and have lived in Camden expect that they're going to work in the Philadelphia area. So this is what's going on here. So they meet their real estate agent, Linda. Here's Linda. And they give her their list of priorities, and she's sort of skeptical about this and says, well, I'll do my best, but you might have to pick. Okay, so I'm going to try not to do anything dastardly. So Linda, because she is a good real estate agent, is finding them lots of houses in the Camden area, which is what they have requested. So she's showing them house after house, and she says, each one, so what do you think? And time and again, Tom and Jennifer have a complaint. And the complaints that they have, so Tom is excited. It's in walking distance of the transit line. And Jennifer says, yeah, but the elementary school is only rated a 1 out of 10. This one's off the list. She can hear traffic. There's gang activity. There's one that's near a park, but it's next to the public housing complex. So they get frustrated. And they tell Linda that they're frustrated. So Linda suggests that they start looking outside of Camden. She wants to sell them a house. She wants them to be happy. She suggests, why don't you try looking in Cherry Hill instead? So they start to go to look at houses in Cherry Hill, and Derek did an amazing job of showing you how different the houses look in Cherry Hill than they look in Camden. They don't have old world charm, but they're new and beautiful, and they have big wide sidewalks and big wide streets. But Tom says he's not excited about driving this far, and it's expensive. So they're asking Linda, how did it come to be? Tom wants to know why Cherry Hill is so different from Camden. And so he says, is it just racism? Is that what this is? Am I looking at racism? And Linda says, and then he says, or is it just that some people have more money than others, right? Maybe just some people can afford Cherry Hill and some people can afford Camden. And Linda says, that's not it. That you're missing the bigger picture here. Politics, she says at the bottom. So Linda grew up in this area, and she explains the history of segregation by design. She says it really isn't about individuals' choices, but the fact that local governments a long, long time ago institutionalized racism, building it into the cities themselves. So how does this work? Well, she explains briefly, and I'm going to explain in a little bit more detail, that since the earliest days of United States urban development, local governments have influenced property values and strategically allocated public benefits. Who's going to get that park? Who's going to get the transit stop? They've allocated public goods in such a way that has benefited their most powerful constituents. And remember, this story starts in the early 1900s. And those most powerful constituents were the property owners at the time. And it doesn't take much to realize that most of the property owners in these places were white. That's how the segregation starts. Local politics is at its core the politics of land use. It is the single most important power that local governments have. And it is more powerful at the local level than any other level of government. It's the uniqueness of local government is the power of land use. And so local politics has been used by property owners seeking to enhance their wealth and control the allocation of services like schools through land use regulation, zoning, and redevelopment. And it is through these processes that segregation has been created along both race and class lines. So Linda goes on. She explains, it's not that racism isn't driving this process. It's that racism is embedded in this process, and so therefore very difficult to get out of the process. She explains that over time, white property owners saw their land use designs and their control over public goods threatened by demographic change, by shifts in political power, and even higher levels of government coming in and forcing integration in various ways. When such threats appeared, though, white property owners moved the scale of segregation. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this in just a little bit, but sort of the short version is, a long time ago, segregation used to be between neighborhoods, right? You would have one neighborhood segregated from another neighborhood. But over time, that segregation has expanded so that now we have segregation between cities, not just within a single city between neighborhoods. And it is this process, moving around to try to recreate segregation, that has produced this outcome. So white property owners expand the scale of segregation, moving to suburbs that ultimately divide cities. And you can see here that they're sitting at they're looking in to a community meeting. This is the city council, who is trying to build a highway through a particular neighborhood. And in one case, and then in another case, they are trying to build low-income housing. And this is the picture you're seeing here. The city council's seeking to build low-income housing. And you see these signs: too much traffic, vote no, protect our home values, only single-family homes in this neighborhood. That's when it starts. That's when these claims start. And they are directly tied to the history of land use regulation in this country. So finally, we get to the end where Linda explains the results of segregation. And I started off by telling you that the most obvious result of segregation is that some people have good stuff and other people have cruddy stuff. But there are other results of segregation. And one of the most interesting pieces for me as a political scientist is that segregation also produces political polarization. And that's what I'm showing here in these charts. So that what we end up with is this political and geographic overlay of people's interests that ultimately produces what I argue is segregation at the national level. And we can see it in even presidential elections. For more than 100 years, this process has benefited those people who owned first, the incumbents and their allies. And it has disadvantaged people of color and those at the economic margins. After entrenching this subdivided landscape, white property owners became free to claim that segregation was simply the result of differences in individual preferences. And they decried governmental attempts to desegregate neighborhoods and spread public goods as infringements upon their rights. And this is one of the patterns that you see over time is a shift from defending segregation to an attempt to protect our rights, our neighborhood. And that's the language that we end up with today. So I use data going back to the early 1900s. I start in 1890, and I trace the way that segregation has been entrenched in these cities. I look at planning, and I look at zoning and redevelopment, and I can show in all these different cases that there are links to the early stages of segregation in 1900. But I also find that where and when people of color had political voice, where they were mobilized and had access to city government, segregation and inequality were reduced. And so that's a first place of hope, I think, in this story, is to think about what are the factors that can limit these kinds of processes. In the decades after World War II, the political voices of marginalized people grew louder. And as people of color contested municipal elections, demanded an end to Jim Crow, and the federal government took action against segregation, the control of white property owners became increasingly uncertain. And it's at that point that we had a massive shift to suburbanization. And ultimately, that's where we're stuck. We haven't seen very much change in segregation along racial lines since the 1970s. It peaked, and then it sort of flattened out between cities. Sadly, unfortunately, we have seen a massive increase in class segregation over the same time period, which is probably not surprising to a lot of people here. So this is very depressing, right? I just spent 10 minutes telling you about how terrible this is. And it's funny, so when Derek and I wrote this comic, I got to the end and I said, you know, this is okay, it's very depressing. I'm an academic, this is what I found. And he said, I am not drawing this comic if you do not provide a solution. And so he said, I'm going to make you do it. And so I don't have the graphic here because it was the last page of the comic. But if you want to take a look at it, it's a little me, Jessica, going door to door and trying to get people to build affordable housing. And that was what Derek and I finally agreed was an okay solution for the time being. So the situation is not immutable, but it is difficult to address. The first step toward policy solutions is to recognize really and truly in your heart to understand that segregation is purposeful and that it has existed on purpose for more than 100 years. The geography of our communities did not happen accidentally, and the people who create segregation, maintain segregation, and benefit from segregation are always, 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 always those who are most opposed to undoing it. So the first thing to recognize is that there will be a coalition of blockers to any attempt to change this situation. But the undoing is possible. One of the factors that I have found really affects the ability to integrate are big footprinted school districts. So when you have school districts that cover a very large area, it is easier to integrate those communities, those schools. And I can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested, sort of more details about these solutions. States can try to force cities to build more integrated housing, multifamily housing, to encourage more efficient and dense land use. But in the process, we must be vigilant to ensure that communities do not force that we do not force multifamily housing into marginal neighborhoods or tight spaces, right? We don't want to, at the same time that we're producing a solution, create some other problem like gentrification. New middle-class housing is often squeezed by affordable housing requirements on the one hand and the need for profit by developers on the other. And we should recognize that developers do need to make a profit in this system and to try to figure out what are the policy solutions that can allow them to be partners rather than in opposition to this process. Increased supply does not always lower cost. It really depends where it's built. The key, my research shows, is to prevent privileged residents from allowing their communities to maintain lower densities while higher densities get pushed to marginal communities. Low-income residents could be given massive housing subsidies to allow them to move and make choices. I'm not super optimistic about that policy solution, but it is a policy solution, and we should think about the range of solutions. Ultimately, if breaching segregation, residential segregation proves unworkable, more can and I think should be done by state governments to spread and redistribute public services. Many states have tried to do this with school funding, and we have some evidence that there has been some limited progress in doing this. We could do this with water too, right? A community that has a lack of access to clean water could be given a subsidy from the state to clarify their water, to get clean water. These are possible solutions, but garnering state support for either desegregation or redistribution will require tremendous political pressure from marginalized groups and their allies, and that is admittedly a daunting task. But these groups may find support in businesses and residents who've been priced out of unaffordable markets, and we're seeing this movement in California now in a way that we haven't in the past, partially because the middle class has been squeezed out of housing markets in a way that is new. Advocacy groups, citizens organizations, and concerned policymakers should make building this coalition for a more just and equitable desegregated society a priority.
So, Ernest, if we could pass in any questions that you may have, take a moment, pass any questions you may have to Ernest or Victoria. I was just going to get it kicked off. I have two questions. In your conclusion, both in your remarks and in the book, you offer two policy choices or paths forward. One is spatial desegregation, mobility, Section 8 vouchers, upzoning wealthy neighborhoods. Another option is the equalization of public goods and public services, investing in communities that have been underinvested in for decades. Given these two options, there is some tension sometimes between mobility and community investment. Do you think that tension is necessary? Is there a way to move forward with both options, or do they necessarily come at the expense of another?
It's a really interesting question. So my sense is that the better solution is true integration. Share. I'm gonna try not to kill anybody. So generally, I think that the ideal solution is to actually integrate, but that has proven to be quite difficult, and we have a long history of attempts at integration in various ways that have been avoided. And ultimately, what I've seen is many examples of privileged communities maintaining that privilege in some way. And so, if that's going to be the status quo, then at least we can force the privileged communities to provide support for less privileged communities, right? So I guess I see this, I think they are in tension. And the question about sort of mobility is really, again, assuming that true integration isn't possible, right? That we don't actually build the proper housing for the people who need, at the right price point for various people. But we could provide housing subsidies in order to allow everybody to choose the same level of housing.
And so my next question is about it's been in the news, at least on Sundays, Article 34 of the California State Constitution. For those of you who may not be familiar, Article 34 was passed in 1950 and requires an election by the voters of a community in order to build low-income and public housing. It's the LA Times wrote a really great in-depth piece on it that was in the paper yesterday. But it's discriminatory against low-income people, requiring, for example, you can imagine how many Article 34 elections Oakland has made in the last 50 years, and then think about how many Article 34 elections Marin has made in the last years, which is 0. So given that, it has a chance of being repealed for the first time in 25 years. SCA 1, constitutional.
So I'm not super optimistic about. In 2002 and 2016, and I can tell you that there were many initiative elections where local voters were on the ballot the ability to block low-income housing and maintain low densities in their communities. So there are a lot of places, and these passed, right? So there are a lot of places in California where I think there are pockets where the repeal of 34 would probably be very popular, but statewide, I'm less optimistic.
Can you elaborate on how large school districts can serve as a solution to segregation?
So the history of large school districts in the South is really interesting. Large school districts, big footprint school districts were created in the South predominantly to ensure that only one Black school would have to be built in the district, right? So we're talking the timing of segregated schools, and there's a requirement-ish to provide schooling for Black children. And so what that meant was building a separate school for Black children. If the school district, though, was very large and covered the entire county, the county could get away with building just one Black school. So it has its roots in a racist policy and an attempt to not provide schooling to Black children. But once Brown v. Board of Education actually gets implemented in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, what happens is school districts have to start integrating schools at some level, desegregating schools at some level. And it is easier to desegregate within a school district than it is to desegregate across a school district. And when you have very large footprints for school districts, people can't move far enough away to recreate the segregation because they move too far away from their jobs, right? So there's some caveats to this, but generally speaking, places that have larger boundaries, both in terms of the city boundary, so people can't move to the suburbs and segregate that way, and the school district having a very large boundary, both of those turn out to be solutions that provide a leverage for more integration in housing and in schools. So I don't know who asked that question, but did that answer the question?
Can you give examples of places where desegregation has been successful?
I was just telling my parents that I always get this question and I don't really have a good answer to it. It's very frustrating. So I can give you a few, I can say a few things about this. One, so many of you may know that Minneapolis recently upzoned the entire city. Woo! Right. So we'll see. We'll see whether or not the upzoning of the whole city actually prohibits privileged neighborhoods from preventing development. It's possible. And I'm optimistic that I'm going to at least have good study to do. And so that's possible, right? So we might look to Minneapolis and try to understand how it is that they came to make this decision and learn more about the kind of coalition that backed this. Minneapolis has a long history of understanding its embeddedness in a region. And there's been lots of policies over the course of Minneapolis's history where they have worked collaboratively as a metro area. And this is, I think, the newest of their example of something that they're doing to try to create a positive outcome for the area as a whole. The other set of cities that I have looked at are places where I've tried to identify places that are fairly diverse, right? If you're not diverse at all, then segregation isn't meaningful to talk about. What we want to understand are places that are fairly diverse, but also have low levels of segregation, both that within city kind of segregation and that across city segregation. And so I created a list of the places that do best on these measures, and probably most of you are going to be interested in the California cities, but like Davis, California is a place that scores fairly well on this, right? So again, I think this is future work to be done. I don't have a lot of in-depth evidence about Davis. Riverside is another place that is very diverse and scores fairly well on these indices. And so, so I think, maybe my graduate students will go off and write studies about this, but I don't have a great answer to that question yet.
Do you have any opinions or conclusions on the demographic shifts between suburbs or places that are getting browner and cities that may be getting whiter? Do you think this will create a new era of segregation or resegregation or maybe better suburbs? I
guess that depends how you define better. I think integrated is better. So yes. So there's this question brings up a very interesting fact, which is that I'm going to say a couple things and you'll see how I get ultimately to answer the question. I'll get there. It used to be the case, we have in our minds this mental image of cities that are filled with people of color and are ringed by white suburbs. That's a thing that we think exists. And that thing doesn't exist and it never existed. Here's why it doesn't exist and it never existed. When it was true that suburbs were all white, suburbs were not places that most people lived. They were tiny and they couldn't really do anything. And there weren't any jobs in the suburbs. So very few people lived in the suburbs. So that was true, right? There was a time period when Cherry Hill literally was all white, or San Leandro was all white. But it was a very small part of the population. So there are very few places in the United States that fit this image of what we have. And Detroit is one of them, right? So Detroit is a place where it's a city of color that is ringed by very large, powerful white suburbs. But most of the United States has much more diverse suburbs than that, and has had more diverse suburbs for a very long time. And suburbs have been growing more diverse as they've aged. So one thing to say here is that and then at the same time, we have seen whites moving back into central cities, but that's not mostly what's happening. So the census data tell us that cities are still hollowing out. Even though there has been this movement back to the city center in a few metro areas in the United States, it's still the case that depends how you measure it, most of the population movement among white and wealthy residents is still to the edges of cities and to suburbs outside of the city center. So I don't see a big shift in the patterns that I described, ultimately. Now we have had changing immigration patterns and a massive increase in the Latino population in the United States as a whole, and that has diversified our suburbs. Here's the last thing I'll say on this: the whitest white suburbs are still the whitest white suburbs. So there are still neighborhoods in the United States that are basically 100% white, embedded in a metro area that is very diverse. And those places have maintained their privilege, and it is those places that are the most resistant to the kinds of policies and integration that we've talked about.
You speak about integration, but what are ways that cities can minimize the impacts of gentrification in pursuing integrative policies?
This is a really good question, and one that I haven't written about, but some really, really smart friends of mine at Boston University have been working on a book about this. And essentially what they say is something that I mentioned briefly in my comments, which is the way to prevent gentrification from displacing people is to try to ensure that it is not marginalized communities that end up with all the development. To make sure that the development is spread more evenly across the metropolitan area, and that you don't maintain places where the privilege remains, because otherwise you end up producing another problem by providing a solution.
Do you have any observations about whether district-based local elections, i.e. kind of a geographic-based or a neighborhood-based district election, can help empower minority communities to influence land use policies?
Ooh, that's a really it's a good research question. So I've written a lot about district elections, and the very short answer to that question is yes. The district elections are phenomenally better at protecting minority interests and producing city councilors who are people of color than are at-large elections. Whether they've been able to differentially impact land use regulation, I don't know, but my guess is that the answer would be yes. When you have people of color on city councils, over the history of the United States, they overwhelmingly produce more equal outcomes and lower segregation in the cities in which we see people of color elected to office.
I think this question is a little bit more of a kind of looking for an answer, but how do you battle the fact that the people who benefit from segregation are also the people who support politicians seek to get elected and to remain in office?
Yes. That's true. That's how politics works, right? People who benefit from policy are the most active, vocal, and influential. That's how so the only way to counteract that is to mobilize on the other side, right? And to make sure that you try to build community voice and help people to understand what's at stake if they don't mobilize. Because the people who stand to gain monetarily from any policy have a built-in motive to participate. And the motive to participate for people who have sort of, maybe my rent will be lower in 10 years, right? It's much more amorphous. So we have to continually convince people that their participation is worth their time and their energy.
As somebody who teaches at the University of California, Merced, how do you see these types of issues playing out in the San Joaquin Valley? Do they differ from the Bay Area? Do you have different solutions for the San Joaquin Valley?
This is a great question. So I am from UC Merced. I've been there for almost a decade now. So I've watched the university grow from a little tiny place to like an actual university. We have students and they walk around the hallways, and it's, yeah, right, really. It was, when I first got there was nobody. It was like crickets. But lots of cows. We have a housing crisis in Merced right now. Right. Oh, geez. Yeah. And we have a housing crisis in Merced because after the crash, buildings stopped. And then homeowners who lost half of their equity wanted to make sure that they regained their equity. How do you regain your equity? You prevent new housing from being built. And we are now at a point where our students can't find rental housing. So they're cramming into these gigantic mansions that were built before the boom, right? So they're like mansions, 6-bedroom houses, but they've got like 14 kids living in them. And it's not, so in some ways we're facing similar problems. I think the solutions, where the Valley is different than the Bay Area or any place like the Valley is different, is that the demand for people to live in the Valley is still lower than the demand to live in the Bay Area, right? So housing is still a lot cheaper in the Valley than it is in the Bay Area. But the people who own houses in the Valley act the same way that people who own houses in the Bay Area act. And that's true across the United States, right? So in Iowa, it's also cheaper to live there than it is to live in the Bay Area. But Iowan homeowners act the same way that Bay Area homeowners do. So I think the solutions have to take into consideration that cities like Merced are much more desperate for population and business. And so they're more willing to do things that are going to benefit the development community, the economically advantaged, because they feel worried that they're going to lose out on development.
Do you have much hope for the project of fair housing, and consequently, especially the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule? And California just passed a kind of their own version of that rule. For background, the Trump administration is preparing to rescind this rule that requires cities to make positive steps to remove barriers to fair housing. California passed their own version as kind of a stick in your eye to the Trump administration. But do you have any opinions on that?
I have lots of opinions on lots of things, so the answer is usually yes. But on that question, I actually, this is a more hopeful response. So I have a paper where I show that in places where the Federal Fair Housing Act was litigated, 10 years later, the city is more integrated than it otherwise would have, by a lot. By like, you see more people, the increase in the percentage of people of color that live in places where a judge has found that the city violated the Fair Housing Act. You see an increase of 10 to 20% percentage points in the population of people of color. So the problem with the Fair Housing Act and the whatever the acronym is that it causes in order to work, you have to litigate. So I think just having the cities do this sort of rule in place, the cities go like, oh, okay, we're getting to that soon. We'll build some affordable housing. We can't find any property to do it. It's just so restricted here, right? So you have to sue in order to force cities to change their land use patterns. But if you sue and you win, my research shows that there's pretty good evidence that it works.
So follow up on that is, so California just passed AB 686, which enacts the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. You say that cities need to be sued to actually make this happen. It's not you need somebody with the stick, so to speak. Do you think that California should maybe have a private right of action for affirmatively furthering fair housing? Because currently AB 686 requires the attorney general or whatever the institutional attorney to make that decision. Do you think that advocates for fair housing should be pushing for that private right of action for AFFH rather than waiting for Xavier Becerra or someone else to do it?
I think that would be a helpful. I think that would assist in the process. We use litigation in California to prevent development just as much as we do to promote development. So a lot of that depends on whether or not you end up getting sort of dueling lawsuits about CEQA or something else, right, that is being used to stop the kinds of development that we're talking about. So if Becerra brings the suit, it may be more powerful. I don't know whether or not that's the case, but I think it certainly couldn't hurt to empower the people who are impacted negatively by these kinds of policies in a easier way.
This question is about kind of the specificity of policies. How do localized solutions? How localized do solutions have to be? Is something that works in New York City, will it necessarily work in Chicago or San Francisco?
So generally, because I am a quantitative social scientist, most of my research is uses thousands and thousands of cities in any analysis that I do. So I don't. So on average, cities act the way that I say that they do. But yes, there are differences from place to place. And so a solution that works in one place is not likely to work exactly the same way in another place. That's absolutely correct, right? So Merced and San Francisco are always going to have different economic markets, and that we need to take that into consideration when doing this. But I thought this question was going to go in a slightly different direction. So I guess I'd sort of end that comment by saying that's why we need people on the ground who know what the policies are that are needed in that community, right? So you can that's we need people who are experts in their local communities to participate. But I thought this question was going to go in a little bit different direction, to talk about sort of where we fight, where you fight for these kinds of policies. And ultimately, I think that local control is what has produced these kinds of outcomes. And so state levers and federal levers, I think, are a better place to focus attention.
You actually predicted the next question. But to build off of that, what are some of the, given some of the conversations at the state of California level and in the legislature, what are some of the pitfalls you think advocates need to be aware of in terms of where local control should be, I don't want to say respected, but it should be considered in when we're making kind of these legislative changes and reforms for restrictive zoning and land use?
I think the people that need to have the most protections to maintain local control are marginalized communities, right? So people have to be able to say, we have always accepted the low-income housing in this state, and we don't want to accept more development, right? That has to, the communities that have suffered by the hand of segregation have to be the communities. If local control is going to exist at all, that's where it should exist. I mean, generally, I think local control is problematic. Although, there are many, many examples of states trying to force local communities to do things. And like I said, so Cherry Hill is a terrific example of this. They have been sued 47,000 times to build low-income housing, and they just keep pushing it off. And they're in the midst of a big lawsuit right now, and it's gone on since the 70s. So that, it'll happen in increments.
In your studies, have you noticed any rise in the level of restrictive zoning among communities after the passage of the Rumford Act in California? The Rumford Act was a law passed in 1963, I believe, by Berkeley legislator Byron Rumford, that outlawed the I guess race-based restrictions on realtors selling houses to people of color, and then it was repealed in 1964 by Prop 14. Have you noticed any correlation between the passage of Rumford Act and Prop 14 and increase in restrictive zoning?
I haven't, but I haven't looked, is the true answer. But I doubt that would have caused an increase in restrictive zoning, since the restrictive zoners won. Prop 14 was what the restrictive zoners wanted. And so there wasn't a need for them to engage in more restrictive zoning following that act. It went down by a big margin. So they weren't worried that it was coming back. Ultimately, Prop 14 got ruled unconstitutional. So maybe that's what causes the change in exclusionary zoning. Local communities react very quickly to changes like this. So it's possible, but I haven't looked.
Given that land use restrictions and zoning have been used to purposefully segregate communities, are there ways that we can imagine using them as a force for good and for making our communities more inclusive and stronger?
That's a wonderful question. The people who invented land use policy, developed zoning, invented zoning, they were a class of sort of social scientists, you could call them, they're the planning community. And when they first invented land use regulation and started thinking about how to develop communities and regulate where people lived and what businesses were doing, there was an argument that was made at the time that we could use land use regulation to produce a better whole than what we had. But that the only way to do that was to start from a position where everybody agreed on the goal of that better end. And then we could figure out what land use regulations would be needed to produce that positive end goal. What happened was very quickly, cities decided that they didn't like the planning part. It was hard and annoying and nobody agreed on what the end goal was, but they liked the land use regulation part. And so city after city adopted only the land use regulation part, but not the planning part. And the planners wrote these letter after letter in the newspapers and in academic journals arguing that doing this was going to create inequality and it was going to marginalize people. So the answer is absolutely yes, land use regulation can be used for good. And that's what it was developed for, it was invented for. And then it sort of got sideswiped by the people who could benefit from it.
Companies moving to the Bay Area are associated with increases in property and rental prices. Do we need to think about policies that incentivize companies to move to other areas to help stabilize rental and property prices?
I don't think that's going to be super popular. So local politicians generally are interested in attracting more economic development, not stopping economic development. There are some exceptions to this. And the Valley actually has some interesting exceptions of places that don't want more development because it will compete with the local businesses there. But for the most part, I think that that's a politically not super viable solution. I would like it if the Bay Area would send some of their economy to the Central Valley, but I'm not sure how we convince the people who could make these policies to actually engage in that kind of policy making.
Is the institutional structure of school districts being separate legal entities from other parts of the local government part of the story of segregation? Would rejoining schools to other governance institutions help or have no impact?
I actually think it wouldn't have any impact. And the reason why I think it wouldn't have any impact is that people who want segregated schools are very adept at utilizing land use regulations to produce the kind of segregation that they want in order to produce those segregated schools. So I think it's already happening that land use regulations and school catchment zones are intimately connected to each other. And that's, so I'm not, generally having school districts be a separate entity just means that it's cities that have to do the land use regulation in order to produce the segregation. The school districts can't do it themselves. So I guess it could even make it worse if there was some sort of, confluence of power where those people who were really interested in the schools were joining forces with people who were interested in segregation for other reasons.
So I think we have a couple more minutes. I figure we can open up the floor to any questions that you may have. I'll just, anyone? Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I should have explained. That's terrible behavior on my part. I should never use terms that are without describing what they mean, explaining what they mean. Upzoning means it can mean a couple of different things, but in this sense, in this case, it means making sure that there's no area of the city that has lower density than at least 3-unit housing. So there are lots of places in the United States, in every city, where a certain area of the city is zoned that you can only build single-family housing in that particular neighborhood. Upzoning means those neighborhoods now have to allow in triplexes or more if a developer comes to try to build a triplex in that area. So it removes a density restriction, essentially. And in Minnesota, the density that they've picked is triplexes. So, I mean, I don't know if we're gonna like revolutionize the world by building triplexes, but it'd help a little bit.
Anyone else? Name in the back. So questions about quantifying the impact of the loss of redevelopment and how that and the loss of affordable housing dollars from redevelopment. Is that correct? Yeah. Yeah.
I haven't. I'm sorry. It's a great question and an important policy outcome to understand. I actually haven't done a ton of work on redevelopment. It sort of comes into my work in various places, but I don't even have like a sort of a reaching answer, a guess I could give you. So I'm sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
So I can get very technical in this answer, but I'm going to try not to because that's boring. The studying outcomes and processes below the city level, and by that I mean at the neighborhood level, is challenging. It's hard. It's hard to find the data and it's hard to trace over time what's happened. But generally, when I'm talking about segregation, I'm talking about two types of segregation. The first type of segregation is the type that you just mentioned. Los Angeles as a city is very diverse, but there are some neighborhoods that are all white and other neighborhoods that are all people of color. That's what I call neighborhood to neighborhood segregation. And that was the predominant form of segregation for most of US history, from the beginning when we had no segregation in 1900 basically, to 1970 when it peaks. We have a growing concentration of people of color in neighborhoods that are separate from neighborhoods where white people live within a city. What happens over time, though, is then we get people moving outside of Los Angeles to Calabasas. I don't know LA very well at all, but is that there are cities outside of LA where white people live. I got it right? Okay, good. Okay, Calabasas. So at the same time, we have to hold in our heads these two types of segregation, and they coexist. So Los Angeles can still have very white neighborhoods, and Calabasas can also be very white. And we have to have measures that allow us to analyze which type of segregation is happening when and which is more common. And now what we see is more common, the type of segregation that is more common is the type of segregation where white people move to Calabasas rather than white people moving to a particular neighborhood within Los Angeles. But that's in general. And in certain cities, the pattern is very different. We could talk more about it. I feel like, okay, yeah.
You've talked a lot about people who have power and wealth and their power and wealth. There's an interesting law where racial property value would have gone up. I'm curious. Racist-based paradox, property values and wealth.
So it's a little hard to measure, and Rothstein is brilliant in his work and in his writing, but he's not using the same kind of threshold for evidence statistical evidence that I'm using. So I don't know whether or not I can really answer that question properly. I can say that in the short term, implementing zoning drives up property values in some neighborhoods and plummets them in other neighborhoods. So what we see is the implementation of land use regulation creates inequality in property values. removing those regulations could increase property values in some neighborhoods and decrease them in others. I don't think that there's a universal answer to that. I do think that inequality would be reduced by removing some of these restrictions. Yeah. 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 I would love to be able to analyze that type of integration, because I think that's the meaning of integration. But that's not the kind of work I do. So I don't have a good way to measure that type of behavior. There are people who do that kind of work. They're mostly sociologists, not political scientists. And their work is amazing. It's just very different from mine. So yeah, I define integration very specifically as the population of people of color relative to the population of whites in a very particular geographic space. And the geographic space that I measure in the book it's mostly census tracts, which are about 3,000 or 4,000 people. That's really big. You might think about integration at a much more local level when you're imagining what an integrated neighborhood looks like. You're not thinking about 4,000 people. But I have to measure over time from 1890 to 2010, I have to have the same geographic identifier to be able to measure how segregation changes over time. And so I had to pick this sort of rough proxy for what we think of as a neighborhood. Yes. They change. And so I use GIS to adjust the boundaries of the census tract for every census tract in the United States, for every census from 1890 to 2010. It was really annoying. Yeah. I know. It's so complicated. I don't know. So I actually have a friend who studies similar kinds of topics, and he's at Stanford. So he has access to lots of money. So I've told him that he should run a huge survey where he asks people lots of questions so that we can figure out who is this coalition. And so he has a bunch of work showing that the people that you think of as liberals, right? And however you want to identify that, right? And so he started with, who did you vote for in the 2016 election? Okay, so that seems on the face of it sort of fine, right? You want to think about somebody who voted for Trump as being conservative and somebody who voted for Clinton as being liberal. And then he started to analyze, is this the people who promote housing development in their community? Turns out not so much. And so he and I have not figured out the answer to this question, but I'm hopeful that with his piles of money, he will figure out the answer to this question, and we will figure out what it is. And so one thing, sort of a more serious answer is, I think it may be different in different places, that there are different things that bring people together, that motivate the conversation. It might be environmental protection in some cases. It might be finding housing for the working community in a different situation, right? So in Napa Valley, one of the big conversations is we need to find housing for people who work in the vineyards, then they don't have to drive for 2 hours a day, right? That's an important conversation that the vineyard owners are having. So that's very different than Merced, where we don't have any vineyards, or San Francisco, right? Where the motive for finding this coalition is probably more localized than I realized.
Well, thanks again. I just really appreciate your talk, and guys, round of applause for really great work. So I just want to encourage everyone, if you get a chance, come check out the comic book panels. I think we still have a little bit of food and a little bit of beer. So thanks again for coming. If you're interested in joining us at East Bay for Everyone next Wednesday, what's that? Oh, and tech equity. If you're a tech worker, you're interested in tech equity, you can join them as well. East Bay for Everyone will be having our February meeting next Wednesday at 7 p.m. here. Great. Thank you.